Are these even real men? Summer, 1945. Okinawa. A group of terrified Japanese women arrive at an Allied camp, minds poisoned by years of propaganda. Then, black American soldiers step off the trucks. The women recoil in fear. Whispers spread like wildfire. Everything they've been taught says these men are monsters. But when a buried shell explodes, one sergeant throws himself over the women he's supposed to guard. He saves their lives. He bleeds for strangers who fear him. Then his own lieutenant turns on him. A false accusation, a detained woman, and a choice no man should have to make. Stand for truth and risk everything, or stay silent and let injustice win. When hatred comes from both sides of the war, where does a man find his courage? And what happens when the enemy sees your humanity before your own army does? Southern Okinawa hummed beneath a gray monsoon sky. Rain threatened, but had not yet fallen. The June morning felt heavy and damp. 8 Japanese women shuffled forward in a ragged line. U.S. military police guided them toward a canvas-walled processing camp. Their clothes hung torn and filthy. Their faces showed exhaustion and terror. Aiko Tanaka walked near the front. She clutched a small cloth pouch against her chest. Inside rested her dead fiancé's good luck charm. The weight of his memory pressed on her heart. Propaganda whispers filled her mind. Americans were monsters. Black men were something worse. Behind her, Reiko stumbled. Hana caught her arm. Both women had survived weeks hiding in caves. They had eaten almost nothing. Sleep had been impossible. Now they faced the unknown. At the same hour, a convoy of U.S. Army trucks rumbled through the camp gate. Black soldiers stepped down from the vehicles. They wore mud-smeared uniforms and tired expressions. Sergeant Calvin Brooks led the engineers from the 95th Regiment. He had spent the entire night clearing mines. Calvin's body ached. His hands were raw. But he kept his posture straight and his face calm. White officers watched him closely. They expected him to falter. He refused to give them the satisfaction. The Japanese women saw the black soldiers and froze. Whispers rippled through their group. One young woman gasped in Japanese. Her voice carried across the yard. "Are these even real men?" A white MP laughed and translated the phrase for his buddy. The words reached Calvin's ears. His jaw tightened. Pain flickered across his face before he buried it. He had survived segregation in Alabama. He had survived white officers in the Pacific. But this foreign fear stung differently. Calvin turned toward the equipment depot. He said nothing. His silence held more dignity than any response could. The women were led into their tent. The engineers moved toward their assigned area. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The oppressive humidity settled over everything. 2 groups of strangers now occupied the same small space. Neither trusted the other. Neither understood what the coming days would bring. Aiko glanced back once. She saw Calvin's broad shoulders disappearing into the shadows. Her heart beat faster. Fear and confusion twisted inside her chest. Everything she had been taught told her to be afraid. But something about his quiet strength made her wonder. Evening arrived with the promise of rain. The women sat inside their canvas tent. A hurried medic brought rationed rice balls and weak barley tea. The food was meager but warm. Aiko ate slowly. Her stomach had shrunk from weeks of near starvation. Across from her, Reiko whispered about the black soldiers. She repeated stories from wartime leaflets. Savages who could not be trusted. Monsters in uniform. Hana nodded along nervously. The other women murmured agreement. Aiko said nothing. She was more educated than most of them. She had studied English before the war. Logic told her that propaganda lied, but fear had deep roots. Across the camp, Calvin stood beneath a canvas awning. Lieutenant Harrington supervised the equipment inventory. The white officer from South Carolina treated the engineers with barely concealed contempt. He leaned over Calvin's shoulder. "Redo this log," Harrington said. "Make it neater." Calvin glanced at the paperwork. His handwriting was already clear. The log was complete and accurate. But arguing would only make things worse. He nodded. "Yes, sir." Harrington smirked and walked away. Calvin picked up his pencil. Anger burned in his chest. He swallowed it down. A black sergeant could not afford anger. Not here. Not anywhere. As dusk deepened, Aiko stepped outside the tent. The air felt slightly cooler. Rain still threatened but held back. She needed space to breathe. She needed to think. From where she stood, she could see the equipment area. A single lantern illuminated Calvin's workspace. He bent over the supply forms. His movements were careful and precise. He spoke quietly to a younger soldier. His voice held patience. Aiko watched him for several minutes. This man did not match the propaganda images. He showed no cruelty, no violence, only quiet competence and exhaustion. The disconnect troubled her. Everything she had been taught suddenly felt uncertain. Thunder cracked overhead. The first raindrops began to fall. Aiko returned to her tent quickly. Her clothes grew damp. Calvin pulled tarps over the supply crates. Rain drummed against canvas throughout the camp. Both of them lay awake that night. Neither could explain the strange awareness growing between them. Neither knew what the morning would bring. The storm grew louder. Lightning flashed. War had taught them both to fear what came next. Morning arrived after a long rainstorm. Water pooled in low areas throughout the camp. The air smelled of wet earth and canvas. Engineers gathered for their daily briefing. Calvin led a small work detail. Their task was to inspect the area for unexploded ordnance. Monsoon weather often shifted buried shells. The work was routine. It was also dangerous. The Japanese women queued near the processing tent. They waited for questioning by U.S. officials. Their clothes still felt damp from the night rain. Aiko stood near the front. She would translate for the others when possible. Her English was rusty but functional. A white MP joked loudly nearby. His voice carried across the yard. He said the Japanese women didn't smell half bad after a wash. Another sergeant laughed. He added a crude remark about black men being interested in any woman who would look at them. Calvin heard every word. Heat rose in his face. He kept his eyes on the ground. Safety came first. Humiliation could wait. He had learned long ago to separate his work from his feelings. His team spread out behind the women's tent. Calvin knelt near a suspicious mound of earth. His trained eye spotted rust beneath the mud. He brushed soil away carefully. A mortar shell emerged. It was from an earlier shelling. The fuse looked intact. "Everyone back," Calvin said quietly. His men retreated. Calvin examined the shell more closely. It was old. The casing showed corrosion, but the pressure fuse might still be active. He began defusing procedures. His hands moved with practiced confidence. The Japanese women continued their questioning nearby. They did not know about the danger 20 feet behind them. Aiko answered questions for an elderly woman. Her voice remained steady despite exhaustion. Calvin worked silently. Sweat beaded on his forehead. The shell shifted slightly in the mud. Something clicked deep inside the mechanism. Calvin's heart jumped. His hands froze. The sound was wrong. Everything was wrong. Time seemed to slow. Calvin opened his mouth to shout a warning. The world exploded before the words could leave his throat. The mortar shell detonated with a deafening blast. Dirt and shrapnel flew outward. The concussion knocked Calvin forward. He threw himself toward the tent without thinking. His body covered Aiko and 2 other women. Debris rained down. Screams filled the humid air. Calvin felt something hot slice across his left arm. Pain followed instantly. Another engineer hit the ground hard. The tent fabric tore. Canvas flapped wildly. Aiko lay pinned beneath Calvin's weight. She could not breathe. Her ears rang violently. Then the pressure lifted. Calvin pulled himself up. Blood soaked his sleeve. He grabbed Aiko's arm. "Crawl," he said. "Move now." His voice was urgent but not panicked. Aiko obeyed. Her body moved on instinct. She dragged herself toward clear ground. The other women followed. Reiko sobbed. Hana's face had gone white. MPs rushed in from all directions. They secured the area. Medics arrived with supplies. Calvin stood upright, despite the blood running down his arm. He pointed to the wounded engineer. His voice stayed calm. "Davis needs attention first. Check him." A medic grabbed Calvin's arm. He tried to pull away. The medic insisted. Blood flowed steadily from a deep gash. Shrapnel had cut through cloth and muscle. The medic wrapped it quickly. Lieutenant Harrington appeared only after the danger passed. He surveyed the scene with narrowed eyes. His gaze landed on Calvin. "What the hell happened here, Sergeant?" "Unexploded ordnance detonated during defusing," Calvin said. "Standard procedure was followed." Harrington's mouth twisted. He did not acknowledge the lives Calvin had saved. Instead, he turned to an MP. "You caused a panic. Next time, secure the area better." Calvin said nothing. Arguing was pointless. Harrington walked away. The medics finished bandaging. Calvin's arm throbbed. He glanced toward the women. Aiko sat on the ground. Her hands shook. She stared at Calvin with wide eyes. Her entire worldview had just shattered. This man, this supposed monster, had thrown himself over her. He had absorbed the danger meant for her. Their eyes met for one brief moment. Calvin nodded once. Then he turned away. Medics led him toward the medical tent. Aiko remained frozen. Reiko whispered something to her. Aiko did not hear. Her mind replayed the explosion. She replayed Calvin's protective gesture. Propaganda could not explain what had just happened. Morning came with bright sunlight and lingering humidity. Calvin emerged from the medic tent. His left arm was bandaged from elbow to wrist. The doctor had given him light duty until further notice. Other engineers greeted him with respect. They clapped his good shoulder. A private named Jenkins grinned. "You scared us yesterday, Sarge." Calvin managed a small smile. His arm ached, but the wound was clean. He had been lucky. Davis had only bruises. No one had died. Across the camp, Aiko helped distribute morning rations. She watched Calvin from the distance. A translation officer noticed her attention. He was a kind, older man from California. "You should thank him," the officer said gently. "He saved your life." Aiko hesitated. Fear still lingered in her chest, but gratitude felt stronger. She nodded slowly. The officer smiled. Lieutenant Harrington assigned Calvin to oversee repairs at a damaged water station. The station sat near the women's area. Harrington's eyes held malice when he gave the order. He wanted Calvin visible. He wanted to watch for any impropriety. As Calvin walked past, Harrington muttered to another officer. The words were just loud enough to carry. "Shouldn't give them special comfort. They're the enemy." Calvin ignored him. Professional distance was his only protection. He gathered tools and headed toward the water station. 2 engineers followed. They began assessing broken pipes. Aiko gathered her courage. Her heart pounded. She walked toward Calvin alone. Other women watched nervously. She stopped 3 feet away, her hands clasped together. She bowed deeply. "Thank you," she said in halting English. "You saved my life." Calvin straightened. Surprise crossed his face. He nodded politely. His voice was gentle. "I'm glad you're safe." Aiko opened her mouth to say more. An MP appeared suddenly. He stepped between them. "Civilians don't chat freely with soldiers," the MP said firmly. "Back to your tent." Aiko's face flushed. She bowed again quickly. Then she turned and walked away. Her legs felt unsteady. Calvin watched her go. Then he returned to examining the pipes. The MP lingered for a moment before leaving. Calvin's chest tightened. Any further contact would be scrutinized. Harrington would twist it into something ugly. He had to be careful. But Aiko's gratitude had touched something deep inside him. It reminded him why he kept fighting, not for glory, for simple human decency. Afternoon heat settled over the camp. Calvin worked at the water station with 2 engineers. They replaced corroded pipe sections and tightened loose fittings. Sweat soaked their uniforms. The work was tedious but necessary. Aiko was assigned to help distribute clean water. She carried buckets to the women throughout the day. The assignment placed her near the water station repeatedly. Brief proximity forced quiet interactions. Calvin handed her a filled bucket. Their fingers did not touch. Aiko nodded her thanks. Calvin returned to his work. Each exchange was careful. Each exchange was watched. Back at the women's tent, Reiko pulled Aiko aside. Her voice was low and urgent. "Do not trust Americans," Reiko said. "Especially not black troops. They're the most dangerous." Aiko frowned. She set down her water bucket. "He saved us," Aiko said quietly. "He was hurt protecting us." Reiko shook her head. Her fear ran deep. "It was a trick. They want us to relax. Then they will hurt us." Aiko did not argue further, but doubt had taken root. She had seen Calvin's courage. She had felt his gentleness. Propaganda felt hollow now. Empty words meant to create fear. Across the camp, Lieutenant Harrington watched from a jeep. He saw Aiko standing near the water station. He saw her speaking briefly with Calvin. His jaw clenched. Irritation flared in his chest. Harrington did not like the comfort Aiko seemed to feel. He did not like the respect Calvin commanded. A black sergeant should know his place. Japanese civilians should fear all Americans equally. This growing familiarity was wrong. He made a mental note. He would correct this situation soon, before rumors started, before discipline eroded. The sun lowered toward the horizon. Calvin reminded his men to finish before curfew. They packed tools and headed toward the barracks. Aiko carried final water buckets back to her tent. She glanced toward the equipment area. Calvin stood silhouetted against the evening sky. His posture remained straight despite exhaustion. His bandaged arm hung carefully at his side. He looked nothing like the monster from propaganda. He looked human, vulnerable, strong. Aiko turned away. Confusion and curiosity warred inside her. She did not understand these new feelings. She only knew that fear was beginning to fade. Something else was taking its place. Night fell over the engineers' barracks. Calvin sat on his cot with paper and pencil. He wrote a censored letter home to his sister in Alabama. His handwriting was careful and small. He described the island's devastation. He mentioned the explosion briefly. He did not mention racial insults. He did not mention Lieutenant Harrington's cruelty. Censors would remove anything controversial. His sister would receive only fragments. Calvin paused and stared at the paper. He thought about the contradiction. He was fighting for a country that segregated him, protecting people who feared him, serving under officers who despised him. But the memory of Aiko's gratitude warmed him. Her halting English, her deep bow. She had seen him as human. That small recognition mattered more than he expected. In the women's tent, Aiko comforted Hana. The younger woman suffered nightmares from the explosion. She woke gasping and crying. Aiko held her hand. She hummed a lullaby her mother once sang. The melody was soft and familiar. It calmed Hana slowly. Other women drifted toward sleep. Only Reiko remained awake. She lay on her mat staring at the tent ceiling. Aiko's changing perspective troubled her deeply. Wind rattled the tent flaps. Distant generators hummed. The night air felt thick and oppressive. Aiko's voice faded to silence. Hana's breathing evened out. Sleep finally came. At midnight, Lieutenant Harrington conducted a barracks inspection. He entered the engineers' area without warning. Men scrambled to attention. Harrington walked slowly down the center aisle. He stopped at Calvin's cot. His eyes scanned the area. Then he spoke. "Your tools need reorganizing. Equipment needs scrubbing. Supply form from yesterday needs redoing. Calvin stood at attention. His face remained neutral. Yes, sir, I'll handle it now. Harrington smiled coldly. He knew the work was unnecessary. That was the point. He wanted Calvin tired, compliant, reminded of his place. See that you do. Harrington left. Calvin gathered his supplies. Jenkins whispered from the next cot. That's bullshit, Sarge. Calvin shook his head slightly. Complaining changed nothing. Resistance only drew more punishment. He worked through the night, reorganizing tools that were already organized, scrubbing equipment that was already clean, rewriting forms that were already correct. Exhaustion weighed on him. But his hands kept moving. His father's voice echoed in memory. A real man stands tall when others try to make him small. Calvin would not give Harrington the satisfaction of breaking. Dawn brought new heat and the smell of boiled rations. Engineers gathered for morning assignments. Calvin's eyes were red from lack of sleep. But his uniform was pressed. His boots were polished. He showed no weakness. Lieutenant Harrington assigned him to supervise ground reinforcement. The location was near the women's section again. Rain had weakened the soil. New support posts were needed. Calvin accepted the assignment without comment. The Japanese women received instructions for basic cleaning work. They would maintain hygiene around their tent area. The task was simple. It gave them purpose. It kept them occupied. Aiko picked up a broom. She swept dirt from the walkway. Other women worked beside her. They spoke little. Exhaustion still clung to everyone. Calvin directed his men to mark post locations. They measured distances carefully. The work required precision. Weak posts meant collapsed structures. Collapsed structures meant injuries. Aiko passed near the work area. Her eyes found Calvin instinctively. She offered a small, timid smile. Calvin nodded back. The gesture was careful, brief. It attracted no attention. But something shifted in that moment. A fragile thread of trust connected them. They both felt it. Neither could name it. War had taught them to fear connection. Yet here it was, quiet, persistent, undeniable. Lieutenant Harrington watched from his jeep. His eyes narrowed. He saw the smile. He saw the nod. Anger coiled in his stomach. This familiarity was intolerable. A black sergeant fraternizing with the enemy. It had to stop. Harrington started the jeep's engine. He drove closer to the worksite. Calvin heard the approach. He kept his focus on the ground measurements. He gave Harrington no reason to complain, but the lieutenant's presence felt ominous, threatening. Calvin sensed trouble approaching. Not from enemy soldiers, not from unexploded shells, from his own command structure, from prejudice that refused to die even in wartime. Clouds gathered overhead. The air grew heavy. Rain threatened again. Aiko glanced toward the darkening sky, then toward Calvin. Her instinct whispered danger, not from the weather, from forces neither of them could control. The morning continued with growing tension. Harrington stepped out of his jeep near the worksite. He walked directly toward Calvin. His boots struck the ground hard. His face showed barely controlled anger. "Sergeant Brooks," Harrington said loudly, "your men are working too slowly." Calvin straightened. His voice remained respectful. "Sir, we're measuring carefully. Ground stability requires precision." Harrington's eyes flashed. He stepped closer. Other soldiers stopped working. They watched nervously. "Don't lecture me on engineering," Harrington snapped, "and maintain proper distance from those women. I've seen you getting familiar." Heat rose in Calvin's face. He had followed every protocol. He had done nothing wrong, but arguing would only make things worse. "Yes, sir, I understand." "Do you?" Harrington's voice dripped with contempt. "Because it looks to me like you're forgetting your place. Those are enemy civilians. You're a colored sergeant. Act accordingly." The words hung in the humid air. Other engineers stared at the ground. Shame burned through them, not for Calvin, for Harrington's cruelty. But none dared speak. Calvin's jaw tightened. His bandaged arm ached. His exhaustion felt crushing, but he stood firm. "I will maintain proper military conduct, sir." Harrington smirked. He had asserted his authority, reminded Calvin of the hierarchy. He turned and walked away. The Jeep engine roared to life. Dust kicked up as he drove off. Calvin returned to his measurements. His hands shook slightly. Jenkins approached quietly. "That was bullshit, Sarge. You saved those women's lives." "Doesn't matter," Calvin said. "Get back to work." Nearby, Aiko had heard everything. She understood only fragments of English, but Harrington's tone was unmistakable. Cruelty, contempt. The same ugliness she had witnessed in her own country's military hierarchy. She realized Calvin faced two wars, one against the Japanese, one against his own people. The recognition pierced her heart. That evening, Aiko found a small cloth near the medical tent. She wrapped dried herbs inside. They were meant to reduce inflammation. Her grandmother had taught her the mixture years ago. She waited until dusk. Then she walked past the tool station where Calvin had been working. She placed the wrapped herbs on a wooden crate. She did not look back. She returned to her tent quickly. The gesture was small, dangerous, but necessary. Calvin had protected her. She would offer what little help she could, even if it meant risking punishment herself. Night settled over the engineers' barracks. Calvin finished securing equipment for the day. He found the cloth-wrapped herbs on the wooden crate. Confusion crossed his face. He unwrapped them carefully. The smell was sharp and medicinal. Someone had left these for him. Someone who knew about healing. His mind went immediately to Aiko. Corporal Jenkins noticed Calvin holding the herbs. He grinned and nudged him. "Looks like you got a lady admirer, Sarge." Calvin shook his head quickly. His voice was firm. "It's not like that. She's just grateful." "Uh-huh," Jenkins said. "Just be careful. Harrington's watching you." Calvin knew Jenkins was right. Accepting the herbs created risk. But refusing them felt wrong. Someone had shown him kindness. That mattered. He tucked the cloth into his pocket. In the women's tent, Aiko tried to sleep. Guilt gnawed at her. Leaving the herbs had been impulsive. If anyone discovered what she had done, both she and Calvin could face consequences. Hannah whispered from the next mat. "Was that for the sergeant?" Aiko hesitated, then nodded. Hannah smiled gently. "You have a good heart." Reiko heard the exchange. She turned away sharply. Her disapproval was obvious, but she said nothing. Fear kept her silent. Around midnight, wind picked up. A coastal storm moved inland fast. Rain began hammering the canvas. Engineers rushed outside to check perimeter barriers. Calvin pulled on his jacket. His bandaged arm protested the movement. The storm grew violent. Thunder cracked overhead. Lightning illuminated the camp in brief flashes. Engineers worked to secure loose equipment. Water pooled rapidly across the ground. Calvin's team checked the women's tent. The stakes were holding, but the canvas was old. It might not survive heavy wind. He made a mental note to request replacement material. Inside, the women huddled together. Rain leaked through small tears in the fabric. Cold water dripped onto their bedding. Aiko held a bucket to catch the worst leaks. Her hands grew numb. The storm raged for hours. Calvin worked through it all. He thought about the women's fear. He thought about Aiko's gesture. A small kindness in a world of cruelty. It reminded him that humanity still existed, even here, even now. Dawn finally arrived with weakening wind. The rain slowed to a drizzle. Exhausted engineers returned to the barracks. Calvin collapsed on his cot. His clothes were soaked. His arm throbbed. But the herbs had helped. The inflammation had decreased. He closed his eyes. Sleep came quickly. He dreamed of Alabama, of his sister's laughter, of a world without war. Morning brought humid heat and standing water. The women's tent had flooded during the night. Their bedding was soaked. Several women shivered from cold exposure. Engineers were called to assist with drainage. Calvin arrived with 2 men and shovels. They began digging channels to direct water away. The work was muddy and exhausting. Aiko emerged from the tent. Her face showed exhaustion. She saw Calvin and approached the supervising medic. Her English was halting but clear. "Women very cold," she said. "Water everywhere. Need dry blankets." The medic nodded. He made notes on his clipboard. Calvin continued digging without looking up. But he heard every word. His chest tightened. These women had survived so much. Now they were cold and wet. Lieutenant Harrington arrived in his jeep. He surveyed the flooded area. His expression showed irritation rather than concern. He called Calvin over. "Brooks, stop playing in the mud. I need crates moved in the depot, now." Calvin straightened. Mud covered his boots and trousers. His bandaged arm was filthy. "Sir, the drainage work needs finishing. The women's area." "I don't give a damn about enemy comfort," Harrington interrupted. "Move those crates. That's an order." Heat rose in Calvin's face. The work here was important. The task Harrington assigned was meaningless. It was pure humiliation, performed in front of the women Calvin had saved. But orders were orders. Calvin handed his shovel to another engineer. "Yes, sir." He walked toward the depot. Mud squelched beneath his boots. Behind him, Aiko watched in confusion. Why was a competent sergeant treated worse than a disobedient child? The injustice made no sense. Calvin spent the next 2 hours moving supply crates. The work was deliberately demeaning. Each crate weighed little. A private could handle the task. But Harrington wanted Calvin humbled, visible, reminded of his place. Other soldiers noticed. Some white soldiers smirked. Others looked uncomfortable. The black engineers seethed quietly, but none intervened. Intervention meant joining Calvin in punishment. Later, while filling water buckets, Aiko overheard white soldiers talking. One complained that black troops were too soft on Japanese civilians. Another agreed. They expected hostility, cruelty, not compassion. Aiko's understanding deepened. White soldiers wanted black soldiers to be as cruel as they imagined all Americans should be. Calvin's decency threatened their worldview. His humanity exposed their prejudice. As dusk approached, Calvin returned to the water station. Aiko arrived to collect water. Their eyes met briefly. Calvin nodded. Aiko offered the smallest smile. The exchange lasted 2 seconds. Lieutenant Harrington watched from 50 feet away. His face hardened, his jaw clenched. This familiarity had gone too far. He would end it tonight. Morning began with routine supply counts. An inventory officer discovered missing items: medical bandages, canteen parts, several small tools. The loss was minor but noticeable. Lieutenant Harrington reviewed the report. His eyes narrowed. He summoned MPs to his tent. His voice carried across the camp. "Someone's been stealing supplies. Find out who." Rather than investigating thoroughly, Harrington made immediate assumptions. He thought about Calvin's interactions with the Japanese women. He thought about Aiko's proximity to the depot. His prejudice shaped his conclusions. He strode toward the women's tent. 2 MPs followed. Aiko was outside folding clean laundry. Harrington pointed at her. "That one. Bring her in for questioning." The MPs hesitated. One spoke carefully. "Sir, what evidence suggests?" "She's been hanging around the depot," Harrington snapped. "Talking to Brooks. It's obvious. Bring her in." The MPs approached Aiko. She looked up confused. One MP spoke slowly in broken Japanese. Aiko understood enough. Her face went pale. The other women gathered nervously. Reiko protested in rapid Japanese. "We stole nothing. We have nothing." The MPs ignored her. They took Aiko's arms gently. She did not resist. Fear filled her eyes. She looked toward Calvin's work area. He was not visible. Calvin heard the commotion from inside the equipment shed. He emerged quickly. He saw MPs escorting Aiko toward the interrogation structure. His heart dropped. He ran toward Lieutenant Harrington. His voice was urgent but controlled. "Sir, what's happening?" Harrington turned slowly. His expression showed satisfaction. "Missing supplies. Your friend is being questioned." "There's no evidence she took anything," Calvin said carefully. "She's been supervised constantly." Harrington stepped closer. His voice dropped to a vicious whisper. "You're awful concerned about enemy civilians, Sergeant. Maybe you had something to do with this too." Calvin's hands clenched. Rage burned in his chest. But he forced his voice to remain steady. "I'm concerned about justice, sir, not accusations without proof." "Watch yourself, Brooks," Harrington said coldly. "You're one step from insubordination. Maybe you're soft on the enemy. Maybe you're too familiar for a colored sergeant. Either way, you're done interfering." Harrington turned and walked away. Calvin stood frozen. Helplessness crushed down on him. He had saved Aiko's life. He had earned her trust. Now, American racism was being weaponized against them both. The sun climbed higher. Heat pressed down. Aiko disappeared into the interrogation shed. Calvin stared at the closed door. His entire body shook with suppressed fury. The interrogation shed was small and stifling. Afternoon heat turned it into an oven. Aiko sat on a wooden chair. 2 MPs stood across from her. A translator sat nearby. The questions began immediately. Where was she when supplies went missing? Who had she spoken with? Why was she near the depot so often? Aiko answered truthfully. She distributed water. She followed assigned tasks. She had taken nothing. Her voice remained steady despite terror. One MP leaned forward. His tone was aggressive. "You've been talking to Sergeant Brooks. What did you discuss?" "He saved my life," Aiko said through the translator. "I thanked him, nothing more." "Why were you near the supply depot yesterday?" "My water station is nearby. I work there." The questions continued for over an hour. The MPs grew frustrated. Aiko's answers never changed. She maintained calm truthfulness, but they seemed determined to find guilt. Outside, Calvin paced near the engineers' barracks. Corporal Jenkins approached cautiously. "Sarge, this is wrong. Everyone knows it." Calvin's voice was tight. "Knowing doesn't change anything." Jenkins hesitated, then spoke quietly. "We could report Harrington, go to a higher officer." Fear and fury warred in Calvin's chest. Reporting a white lieutenant was dangerous. Black soldiers who challenged authority often faced severe punishment. Court-martial. Dishonorable discharge. Worse. But letting Aiko suffer was impossible. She had done nothing wrong. She was being punished for his mere existence, for showing him basic human decency. Calvin's father's words echoed again. "A real man stands tall when others try to make him small." "Find Lewis," Calvin said. "We need to talk." Jenkins nodded and hurried away. Calvin resumed pacing. His mind raced through options. All carried risk. All demanded courage he wasn't sure he possessed. Inside the shed, Aiko grew exhausted. The heat was unbearable. Sweat soaked her clothes, but she refused to invent false confessions. She remembered Calvin's dignity under Harrington's abuse. She would show the same strength. One MP finally sighed. He spoke to his partner. "She's not breaking. We've got nothing concrete." "Keep her overnight," the other said. "Maybe isolation will loosen her up," the translator informed Aiko. She would remain detained until morning. Her stomach dropped, but she nodded acceptance. Panic would accomplish nothing. As dusk fell, MPs brought her water and a rice ball. The food tasted like ash. She ate mechanically. Outside, the camp settled into evening routines. Somewhere beyond these walls, Calvin was fighting his own battle. She could feel it. Night deepened over the engineers' barracks. Calvin sat with Corporal Jenkins and Private Lewis. They spoke in whispers. The conversation was dangerous. Walls had ears. Lewis revealed something crucial. He had overheard Lieutenant Harrington earlier that day. The lieutenant joked with another white officer about framing Calvin and that Jap girl. He wanted them kept apart permanently. Calvin's stomach twisted. Harrington's cruelty ran deeper than simple prejudice. This was calculated malice, designed to destroy any connection between Calvin and the women he had saved. "We have to report him," Jenkins said firmly. "Colonel Whitford might listen." Calvin shook his head slowly. Fear paralyzed him. Black soldiers who reported white officers rarely saw justice. More often, they saw retaliation, transfers to dangerous assignments, trumped-up charges, sometimes violence. "Whitford won't believe us," Calvin said. "It's our word against a white lieutenant." "Then what do we do?" Lewis asked. "Let Iko take the blame?" The question cut through Calvin's fear. His father's face appeared in memory, strong, dignified, standing tall in Alabama despite Jim Crow, despite threats, despite everything. A real man stands tall when others try to make him small. Calvin took a deep breath. His decision crystallized. "I'll confront Harrington directly. Tomorrow, at dawn." Before he can do more damage, Jenkins looked alarmed. "That's risky, Sarge." "Everything's risky," Calvin replied, "but doing nothing is worse." The three men sat in heavy silence. Outside, wind rustled through camp. Distant generators hummed. The war continued everywhere. But this small battle felt more important than any they had fought. Meanwhile, Iko sat shivering in the interrogation shed. The night air grew cold. She had no blanket, only a thin mat on the floor. Dampness seeped through the walls. She hummed her mother's lullaby softly. The melody brought small comfort. She thought about Calvin's quiet courage, his steady hands during the explosion, his gentle nod after her thanks. He had shown her what real strength looked like. Not violence, not cruelty, dignity under pressure, humanity in impossible circumstances. She would show the same strength. No matter what morning brought, she owed him that much. She owed herself that much. Above, stars emerged between thinning clouds. The same stars shone over Alabama, over Okinawa, over every battlefield where people struggled against darkness. Iko closed her eyes. She prayed not for rescue, but for courage to face whatever came next. Dawn would arrive soon. Truth would emerge, or injustice would prevail. Either way, both Calvin and Iko had chosen their paths. They would walk them with dignity intact. Dawn broke gray and humid. Calvin dressed carefully. His uniform was pressed. His boots were polished. He wanted no excuse for dismissal. He walked toward Lieutenant Harrington's office tent. His heart hammered. His bandaged arm ached. Harrington sat behind a field desk, reviewing paperwork. He looked up when Calvin entered. Surprise crossed his face. "What do you want, Brooks?" Calvin stood at attention. His voice was respectful but firm. "Sir, I request the release of Iko Tanaka. There's no evidence supporting her detention." Harrington's expression darkened. He stood slowly. "Are you questioning my judgment, Sergeant?" "No, sir. I'm requesting justice. Miss Tanaka has done nothing wrong." "Nothing wrong?" Harrington's voice rose. "She's been skulking around restricted areas, talking to soldiers when she shouldn't. That's suspicious behavior." "She was distributing water as assigned," Calvin said. "Her duties placed her near the depot, and I spoke to her first after saving her life. If anyone should face questions, it's me." Harrington moved around his desk, his face flushed with anger. "You're way out of line, Brooks. This is insubordination. This is truth, sir." The words hung between them. Harrington's hands clenched. He was seconds from ordering Calvin's arrest, his mouth open to speak. Heavy boots sounded outside. A voice called out, "Lieutenant Harrington, this is Colonel Whitford. Are you present?" Harrington's face went pale. Calvin's breath caught. Neither had expected this. Whitford was the base inspection officer. His surprise visits were legendary. "Yes, sir," Harrington called. "One moment." He glared at Calvin. His whisper was venomous. "Get out, now!" Calvin stepped aside as Whitford entered. The colonel was older, gray-haired, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He glanced at Calvin. "Sergeant, what brings you here at this hour?" Calvin made a split-second decision. Honesty or obedience, truth or safety. His father's voice guided him. "Sir, I came to discuss the detention of a Japanese civilian. I believe she's being held without proper cause." Whitford's eyebrows rose. Harrington's face went red. "Colonel, this sergeant is interfering with security protocols," Harrington said quickly. "He's been inappropriate with enemy civilians." "Inappropriate how?" Whitford asked calmly. Harrington fumbled for words. "Too familiar, protective, it's suspicious." Whitford turned to Calvin. His gaze was measuring. "Why are you concerned about this woman, Sergeant?" Calvin chose his words carefully. "I saved her life during an explosion, sir. She thanked me once. Lieutenant Harrington has since accused her of theft without evidence. I believe his judgment is influenced by personal bias against both her and me." Silence fell. Harrington looked ready to explode. Whitford's expression remained neutral. "Strong accusation, Sergeant. You realize the consequences if you're wrong?" "Yes, sir, but I stand by the truth." Whitford nodded slowly. He turned to Harrington. "I want a full report, and I want to inspect your supply logs personally, this morning." Colonel Whitford moved with purpose. He summoned supply officers and engineers to the depot. Lieutenant Harrington followed reluctantly. Calvin stood at attention nearby. His future balanced on a knife edge. Whitford reviewed depot records with two assistants. They cross-referenced dates and signatures. Morning sun climbed higher. Heat built steadily. Everyone waited in tense silence. After 30 minutes, one assistant found something. He showed Whitford a signature. The colonel's eyes narrowed. "Who signed out these supplies on June 8th? The supply officer examined the form. His face showed confusion. "This signature doesn't match any current personnel, sir. It's illegible." Whitford turned to Harrington. His voice was cold. "You accused a civilian of theft." "Where's your documentation?" Harrington stammered. "She was seen near the depot multiple times." "So were 50 other people," Whitford interrupted. "What physical evidence connects her to missing supplies?" "Her association with Sergeant Brooks is not evidence of anything," Whitford said sharply. "Continue the search." Engineers and supply officers spread through the depot. They checked manifests against physical inventory. Private Lewis found crates stacked behind a tarp. He opened one. Medical bandages and canteen parts filled it. "Sir, I found them." Everyone gathered quickly. Whitford examined the crates. Tags showed they had been signed out by a U.S. signal unit 5 days earlier. The unit had moved north the same day. They had stored the crates temporarily and failed to update the log properly. The mystery dissolved. No theft had occurred. Only paperwork confusion. Whitford's expression hardened. He turned to Harrington. "You detained an innocent woman based on prejudice and assumption. You ignored basic investigative protocol. You falsely accused a sergeant of conspiracy. This is severe misconduct." Harrington's face went white. "Sir, I was protecting." "You were indulging personal bias," Whitford said. "You're relieved of supervisory duties pending formal review. Dismissed." Harrington saluted mechanically. He walked away. His career had just taken serious damage. Calvin remained at attention. Relief flooded through him. Whitford turned to an MP. "Release the Japanese woman immediately and bring her here." 10 minutes later, Aiko emerged from the interrogation shed. She was pale and tired. She blinked in the bright sunlight. Her eyes found Calvin across the yard. Gratitude and relief washed over her face. Whitford addressed her through a translator. "Miss Tanaka, you were wrongly detained. I apologize on behalf of the United States Army. You're free to return to your quarters." Aiko bowed deeply. Her voice was soft. "Thank you." She walked toward the women's tent. As she passed Calvin, their eyes met. No words were spoken. None were needed. Both had survived. Both had maintained dignity. Justice had prevailed this time. The camp felt lighter. The oppressive tension lifted. Calvin returned to his duties. The engineers welcomed him back with quiet respect. For one brief moment, doing right had mattered more than rank or color. Late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the camp. Aiko returned to the women's tent. Hana and Reiko rushed to embrace her. Tears flowed freely. The other women gathered close. "Are you hurt?" Hana asked in Japanese. Aiko shook her head. "Only tired. They released me." She recounted the interrogation briefly. She downplayed her fear and discomfort, but her hands trembled when she spoke. The experience had shaken her more than she admitted. Reiko's expression was complex. Fear mixed with grudging respect. She had warned Aiko against trusting Americans, yet an American sergeant had defended her. The contradiction troubled Reiko deeply. Across camp, Calvin resumed normal duties under Captain Miller. The new supervising officer treated engineers with basic respect. No unnecessary tasks, no deliberate humiliation, just professional military conduct. Miller pulled Calvin aside after afternoon formation. His voice was quiet. "What you did took courage, Sergeant. Not many men would risk their career for truth." Calvin stood straight. "It was the right thing to do, sir." Miller nodded. "Whitford's preliminary report commends your integrity. That matters. Remember that." The words settled warmly in Calvin's chest. Commendations would not erase racism. They would not change segregation. But they proved that honor still existed, even in war, even here. That evening, Aiko walked to the water station. Calvin checked pipe fittings one final time before curfew. He sensed her approach. He turned slowly. Aiko bowed deeply. Her bow held profound respect and gratitude. When she straightened, tears glistened in her eyes. "You defended me," she said in halting English. "You risked everything." Calvin's throat tightened. He chose his words carefully. "You did nothing wrong. Justice mattered more than safety." "In my country," Aiko said slowly, "few men would do this, especially not for enemy woman." "You're not my enemy," Calvin said quietly. "You're just a person who deserves fairness." The statement hung between them, simple, profound. It contradicted years of propaganda on both sides. Yet it felt completely true. Aiko wiped her eyes. She wanted to say more, but words felt inadequate. Instead, she bowed again. Then she returned to her tent. Calvin watched her walk away. Something had shifted permanently. Not romance, not even friendship exactly, but recognition. Two people who had risen above the lies they were born into. Two souls who had chosen humanity over hatred. As curfew sirens sounded across camp, Calvin felt a bittersweet ache. The war would end soon. Everyone would scatter. He and Aiko would likely never meet again. But this moment would stay with him forever. Proof that dignity could triumph, even briefly, even once. Morning arrived with news of relocation. The Japanese civilians would move to a more permanent facility inland. Engineers received orders to secure transport routes. The transition would begin within days. Aiko helped a U.S. translator organize civilian lists. She checked names and ages carefully. Her English skills made her valuable. The translator praised her accuracy. "You're good at this," the woman said kindly. "Have you thought about translation work after the war?" Aiko paused. She had not thought beyond survival. The future felt impossibly distant. But the suggestion planted a seed. Perhaps she could rebuild something meaningful from these ashes. Calvin supervised equipment loading onto military trucks. The 95th Regiment would transfer to a reconstruction base near Naha. They would support civilian infrastructure projects. Roads, water systems, bridges. He lifted crates with his good arm. The bandaged arm still ached, but healing progressed well. Physical work helped quiet his restless mind. Thinking about departure only brought sadness. He passed near the processing tent. Aiko stood outside holding paperwork. Their eyes met across 20 feet of dusty ground. Calvin nodded slightly. Aiko returned the gesture. The exchange lasted 2 seconds. but understanding flowed between them. Both knew separation approached. Both felt the weight of impermanence. War had brought them together. War would tear them apart. Neither could change that reality. Inside the engineers' barracks, rumors spread. Whitford had recommended formal commendations for Calvin. Some white soldiers grumbled resentfully. They disliked seeing a black sergeant honored. But most engineers supported their leader. Corporal Jenkins clapped Calvin's shoulder. "You earned it, Sarge. Don't let anyone tell you different." Calvin managed a small smile. The commendation felt hollow compared to what he was losing. Not Aiko herself, but the possibility she represented. The proof that understanding could cross any divide, that humanity could flourish anywhere. At midday, trucks began arriving at the staging area. Massive military vehicles, canvas-covered beds, diesel engines rumbling. The relocation machinery stirred to life. Aiko watched from the women's tent entrance. Her cloth pouch felt heavy against her chest. Her fiancé's good luck charm still rested inside, but its emotional grip had weakened. She realized grief had kept her chained to the past. Calvin had shown her that moving forward was possible, even necessary. Hana touched her arm gently. "Are you sad to leave?" Aiko nodded. "I thought I wanted to go home. Now I do not know where home is." Reiko overheard. Her voice was surprisingly soft. "Home is wherever we rebuild it." The three women stood together. Each carried different scars. Each faced uncertain futures. But they had survived. That counted for something. Maybe everything. Early afternoon heat pressed down on the staging area. Japanese women lined up beside assigned trucks. MPs checked names against lists. The process moved slowly but steadily. Aiko clutched her cloth pouch tightly. She wore the same torn clothes from weeks ago. No possessions beyond the charm inside. Everything else had been lost to war. Around her, women whispered nervously. Some feared poor conditions at the new facility. Others simply felt relieved to be alive. Aiko remained quiet. Her thoughts centered on the man who had changed everything. Calvin supervised final mechanical checks on transport vehicles. He examined tire pressure and engine fluid levels. Technical details kept his hands busy, but his mind wandered repeatedly. He spotted Aiko among the departing civilians. She stood near a truck's tailgate. Her small frame looked fragile against the massive vehicle, but her posture held strength, dignity earned through suffering. Captain Miller approached Calvin with paperwork. His expression showed respect. "Sergeant Brooks, Colonel Whitford's preliminary notes commend your bravery during the explosion. They also acknowledge your moral leadership during the false accusation incident." Calvin accepted the papers. His throat felt tight. "Thank you, sir. You're a credit to your regiment," Miller continued. "The Army needs more men willing to stand for truth." The words should have brought satisfaction. Instead, Calvin felt only melancholy. Commendations could not erase segregation. Recognition could not change the fundamental injustice he faced daily. But perhaps it mattered anyway. Small victories against overwhelming darkness. Truck engines roared to life. Black exhaust smoke billowed. Drivers shouted final instructions. The convoy prepared to depart. Aiko climbed into her assigned vehicle. She found a spot near the rear. Other women settled around her. Hana sat close. Reiko took the opposite bench. The truck bed smelled of canvas and diesel. The floor vibrated beneath them. Aiko looked toward the engineer's area one final time. She searched for Calvin among the moving figures. Distance made identification difficult. But then she saw him, standing near a supply truck, his uniform distinct, his posture unmistakable. Their eyes met across the staging area. Time seemed to slow. Calvin raised his hand in a quiet gesture. Not a wave, just acknowledgement, respect, farewell. Aiko bowed from where she sat. Tears welled in her eyes. She did not wipe them away. Let them fall. Let them mark this moment. This man had saved her life twice. Once from an explosion, once from injustice. She would remember him forever. The convoy lurched forward. Trucks rolled slowly toward the exit gate. Aiko kept her eyes on Calvin until distance erased him completely. Then she turned forward, toward whatever future awaited. The convoy traveled several miles along muddy roads. Ruined fields stretched on both sides. Abandoned homes showed blast damage and fire scars. The landscape bore testimony to recent violence. Aiko watched the coastline fade behind them. The ocean disappeared beyond low hills. She felt both loss and strange liberation. The past was truly ending. The future remained unwritten. Women discussed their hopes quietly. An elderly woman prayed for mail service to resume. Hana wondered about food quality at the new facility. Reiko simply wanted a real bed. Simple desires born from immense suffering. Aiko remained mostly silent. She replayed Calvin's final gesture repeatedly. His raised hand, his steady gaze. He had given her something precious. Not safety exactly, but understanding. Proof that human decency transcended propaganda and prejudice. She touched the cloth pouch. Her fiancé's charm felt lighter somehow. The grief that had weighed her down for months was transforming, not disappearing, but evolving. She would always love the man she had lost, but she could honor him by living, by rebuilding, by choosing hope over despair. Rain began falling lightly. Drops pattered against the canvas cover. The sound was almost soothing. Several women dozed despite the bumpy ride. Exhaustion demanded rest regardless of circumstances. Back at the coastal camp, Calvin's unit finished loading their own equipment. They would depart tomorrow for Naha. Different destination, different mission, but the same war-torn island, the same uncertain future. Jenkins found Calvin standing alone near the perimeter fence. He followed his sergeant's gaze toward the horizon, toward the road the civilian convoy had taken. "You okay, Sarge?" Calvin nodded slowly. "Just thinking." "About her?" "About what she represented," Calvin said carefully. "Proof that people can change, that understanding is possible." Jenkins was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke softly. "You gave her something too. You showed her what real courage looks like." Calvin turned away from the fence. His eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. "We all did what we had to do. Nothing more." But both men knew it was more, much more. In a world built on hatred and division, they had chosen differently. That choice mattered, even if no one else remembered, even if history forgot. They would carry the truth inside them, a small flame against endless darkness. The new relocation center appeared at dusk. Wooden barracks stood in neat rows. Guard towers marked the perimeter. The facility was more structured than the coastal camp, but still Spartan, still a prison of sorts. Trucks rolled through the main gate one by one. MPs directed them to assigned unloading zones. The process was orderly and efficient. The women climbed down stiffly, their legs cramped from hours of sitting. Aiko helped distribute blankets from supply crates. She guided elderly women toward assigned bunks. Her English made her useful. Officials quickly recognized her competence. A Red Cross worker asked her to assist with orientation. The barracks smelled of fresh wood and disinfectant. Rows of cots lined the walls. Each woman received a thin mattress and 2 blankets. Luxury compared to cave floors and tent grounds, but still harsh, still temporary. Rain began again as evening fell. Aiko stood near a window. She looked out at the darkening compound. Her mind drifted to the coastal camp, to Calvin preparing for his own departure. She wondered if he thought about her. She wondered if their brief connection mattered to him the way it mattered to her. Hana appeared beside her. "What are you thinking?" "About the sergeant," Aiko admitted. "About everything he taught me." "What did he teach you?" Aiko considered carefully. "That propaganda lies, that dignity matters more than safety, that humanity exists everywhere if we choose to see it." Hana smiled gently. "Those are important lessons." "Yes," Aiko whispered. They are. Meanwhile, back at the coastal camp, Calvin lay on his cot. Other engineers talked and joked around him, but he remained lost in thought. He replayed the explosion, the interrogation crisis, Aiko's bowed gratitude, her final look as the convoy departed. He had fought in brutal battles. He had seen death and destruction, but this quiet farewell felt harder somehow, more final. War took many things, but the loss of human connection cut deepest. Jenkins called lights out. The barracks fell dark. Calvin closed his eyes. He thought about Alabama, about his sister, about the segregated world waiting for him after the war. Nothing would change there. Jim Crow would continue. Prejudice would persist. But he had changed. Aiko had changed. That mattered. Two people from opposite sides. Two people who had risen above hatred. The war could take everything else, but it could not erase what they had proven. Not to the world, but to themselves. Above both camps, stars emerged between rain clouds. The same stars that had witnessed every human struggle throughout history. Silent, eternal, indifferent, but beautiful anyway. Morning arrived with weak sunlight and lingering dampness. Aiko woke early. She joined civilians sweeping walkways and assisting medical staff. The work was simple but purposeful. Structure helped ease anxiety. A Red Cross worker approached her during midday break. The woman's name was Margaret. She spoke kindly. "Your English is quite good. Have you considered translation work after the war?" Aiko paused. The question echoed what she had been asked days earlier. But now it felt more real, more possible. "I have not thought about after," Aiko said slowly. "Only surviving now." Margaret smiled gently. "The war will end. You should think about rebuilding. You have valuable skills." The conversation planted seeds deeper. Aiko began imagining a future. Not her old life. That was gone forever. But something new. Something shaped by everything she had survived and learned. Letters from nearby villages arrived that afternoon. Mail service was gradually resuming. But Aiko received nothing. Her family status remained unknown. The uncertainty ached. But she had grown accustomed to pain. At the coastal camp, engineers received final transfer orders. Departure scheduled for tomorrow at dawn. They would travel to a base near Naha. Reconstruction work awaited. Roads, water systems, the slow rebuilding of a shattered island. Calvin folded his gear methodically. He packed the cloth with healing herbs Aiko had left. He could not bring himself to discard it. The small gesture represented something too important, evidence that kindness existed. That connection was possible. That hope survived. Jenkins noticed him handling the cloth carefully. "You keeping that?" Calvin nodded. "As a reminder." "Of what?" "That doing right matters," Calvin said quietly, "even when it costs something, even when no one notices." Jenkins understood. He clapped Calvin's shoulder. The gesture said everything words could not. They were brothers, not by blood, but by shared struggle, by choosing dignity over bitterness, by refusing to let hatred win. That evening, Aiko walked to the edge of the compound. She stood near the fence line. She looked toward the distant coast. Miles separated her from the place where everything had changed. But memory collapsed distance. She could still see Calvin's steady hands, his calm voice, his protective courage. She would probably never see him again. The war was ending. People would scatter. Lives would diverge. But he had given her something permanent. A new understanding of humanity. A new definition of strength. She whispered a quiet prayer. Not for reunion. That was impossible. But for his safety. For his future. For the life he deserved beyond war and prejudice. The sun set slowly. Orange and purple stained the western sky. Aiko turned back toward the barracks. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new uncertainties, but she would face them differently now, with courage learned from a man who had shown her what real honor looked like. 2 days passed. Calvin's unit departed the coastal camp at dawn. Trucks rolled along winding roads. The convoy moved slowly through damaged terrain. Mines and debris still threatened unwary travelers. Calvin sat near the truck's rear opening. Wind rushed past. He watched the coastline recede. Mixed emotions churned inside him. Relief at leaving Harrington's territory. Sadness at leaving the place where he had met Aiko. War created strange attachments to unlikely locations. Jenkins sat across from him. The corporal studied Calvin's face. "You thinking about her again?" Calvin nodded. No point denying obvious truth. "Wonder if she's okay," he said quietly. "She's strong," Jenkins replied. "You helped her find that strength. She'll be fine." Calvin wanted to believe that, but uncertainty gnawed at him. The relocation centers were better than caves or battlefield exposure, but conditions remained harsh. Disease and malnutrition still killed. Nothing was guaranteed. The convoy reached Naha by midday. The city showed extensive damage. Entire blocks lay flattened. Rubble choked former streets. But rebuilding had begun. Civilian workers cleared debris. Engineers surveyed structural damage. Life was slowly returning. Calvin's unit was assigned to water system reconstruction. They would repair damaged pipes and install new distribution points. Essential work. Unglamorous but necessary. At the relocation center, Aiko helped with morning rice porridge distribution. She had become a trusted interpreter. Officials asked her to assist with medical intake forms. She agreed readily. Purpose helped quiet the restless uncertainty. During a break, she overheard two medics discussing engineer movements. One mentioned the 95th Regiment transferring to Naha. Aiko's heart jumped. She wanted to ask questions, but fear kept her silent. What if they mentioned Calvin? What if they did not? Both possibilities hurt. She walked outside after her duties ended. She stood near the gate. Her eyes scanned the distant horizon. Somewhere beyond those hills, Calvin was starting his new assignment. Miles separated them now. Miles that would only increase. The war was ending. People were scattering. Their paths would never cross again. She accepted this truth. It still hurt, but acceptance brought its own peace. She had known him briefly, but the impact was permanent. He had changed how she saw the world, how she saw herself. That could never be taken away. That night, Aiko hummed her mother's lullaby. But the song carried different meaning now. Not fear, not grief, but remembrance, gratitude. The melody honored what had been, and what would continue. Life moving forward, hope persisting, humanity surviving. 1 week passed. Calvin stood on a reconstructed pier in Naha. He supervised material deliveries for infrastructure projects. The work was demanding, but satisfying. They were building something, not destroying. For once, progress felt real. Captain Miller approached with official paperwork. His expression showed approval. "Sergeant Brooks, your commendation has been officially approved. It will be added to your service record." Calvin accepted the papers. He folded them carefully. The recognition felt distant, abstract. It would not change segregation back home. It would not erase the daily prejudice he still faced. But perhaps it mattered anyway. Proof that doing right counted for something. "Thank you, sir." Miller nodded. "You've earned it. The Army needs more men with your integrity." After Miller left, Calvin stood alone on the pier. Ocean wind carried salt smell and seabird cries. He thought about Alabama, about his sister waiting for him, about the difficult homecoming ahead, returning to Jim Crow after fighting for freedom. The contradiction would sting. It always did, but he had changed. The war had taken much, but it had also given something. Understanding, connection, proof that humanity could flourish anywhere. Aiko had shown him that, just by seeing him as human, by choosing gratitude over fear, by trusting despite propaganda. He would carry that gift forever, through segregated buses and whites-only water fountains, through every insult and limitation. He would remember one Japanese woman who had bowed to him with genuine respect, who had recognized his dignity when his own country refused to. Far inland, Aiko continued her work at the relocation center. She had become an essential translator. Officials discussed permanent placement options. Some women would return to destroyed villages. Others would relocate to intact communities. Aiko had no village to return to. Her family's fate remained unknown, but she felt less afraid. A Red Cross worker had formally offered her translation training. Real work, real future. The war had destroyed her old life completely. But it had also freed her to build something new, something shaped by her own choices, her own courage. While sorting donated supplies, she found a small piece of Okinawan coral. It was shaped roughly into a crescent, weathered and smooth. She pocketed it carefully, a reminder, not of war, but of the man who had shown her rare human decency in a violent world. She would probably never see Calvin again. Geography and circumstance made reunion impossible. But memory made him permanent. He would always represent what she had learned. That propaganda lied. That dignity transcended race. That humanity was the only truth worth believing. Calvin gazed toward the ocean. Waves rolled endlessly toward shore. The same waves that had carried war and would carry peace. He felt bittersweet closure settling over him. The story was ending, not with reunion or romance, but with something deeper, mutual recognition across an impossible divide. Aiko looked toward distant hills. Somewhere beyond them lay the coast, the ocean, the wider world. She imagined calm waves, blue sky, a future free from fear. She would rebuild. She would honor everyone she had lost, including her own lost innocence. By living with the courage Calvin had shown her, though separated forever, both carried shared truth, that humanity could emerge even where hatred once ruled, that dignity could survive any circumstance, that connection mattered, even briefly, even once, especially then. The war was ending, but what they had proven would endure. Two people from opposite worlds, two souls who had risen above lies. The memory would sustain them through whatever came next, a quiet flame against gathering darkness, small, persistent, eternally bright.